Good afternoon and welcome to our next panel, 2 o'clock panel. Today we're going to be discussing economic issues, campaign funding and the impact of money. My name's Lachlan Pole. I'll be the moderator for this session. And joining me on the panel we have Rob Chalmers, who is a senior lecturer in law. He has a special depth in intellectual property, technology and commercialisation, and is particularly interested in the interaction between the development of technology, society and regulation. And I'm sure we'll get to the impact of social media companies and how they're getting past traditional media regulation. So we'll cover that. Roger Wilkins, who is an associate lecturer at the College of Business, Government and Law. He brings more than 30 years' experience providing strategic advice for American politicians at the local, state and federal levels. And Josh Sunman, who is a PhD student at the College of Business, Government and Law, and he is investigating democratic stagnation in electoral regimes and has a significant amount of experience teaching populism and economic populism, particularly with regards to the United States. So let's start with Roger. The impact of money. So we're talking super PACs, we're talking, campaign finance. What sort of impact does that have on American elections and American politics, and how might have that changed over the last, decade or two?
Yeah, I think that $15 billion will make everybody raise their eyebrows. A particular race right now for president is running at $15 billion. It's about $2 billion per candidate, and these numbers are just astronomical. They really are. What does it mean? It means I should have been a media buyer. That's what it should have been. Okay? Because most of this is on television. Most of these are ads. But a lot of it does go to the grassroots. Okay, we are trying to mobilize voters on both sides of the ticket. And but at the end of the day, just get your head around 15 billion, because that's what you're talking about. There's an entire economy going on inside of the presidential race. So, but I mean, how does it mean? I mean, I remember when it went north under Obama and Bush. It went north of $1 billion. That was $1 billion then. That was a marker. Just to give you an idea, today one of the U.S. House Representatives candidates will spend $3 million. When I got started in 1992, it was $250,000. So I mean, just the scale. Again, I should have been a media buyer, but the fact is it's going to TV, it's going to messaging, it's going to influence, it's going to drive vote. One thing that you don't experience here necessarily on a large scale is having to get out the vote. A GOTV program, however, I hate to tell you, but it doesn't get the majority of the funds. A lot of it's activists spending a lot of time on phones, knocking on doors, trying to get people to do their duty. But if you had to quantify that, it would probably be another 15 billion, because a lot of blood, sweat, and tears tonight have been expensed. People haven't been home. They've been working for their candidates and their parties.
So with that in mind, I mean, it's no surprise that candidates are looking to other forms and other ways of trying to, maybe spend a little less money or spend their money in slightly more efficient ways. Rob, in terms of how that interacts with the media, how that interacts with social media in particular, Roger mentioned influencers before. Give us a bit of a sense about how that interaction and potentially the pros and cons of those new developments in technology.
Sure. So it's big money, as Roger said, and the big checks are now coming out from Elon Musk. So he's handing out literal big checks and figuratively big checks of $1 million a day to people who join the America PAC and sign on to those issues. There was some legal challenge, but my vague understanding is that at least temporarily the judges waved that through, so he's still doing that stuff. And the money comes from somewhere. It's a lot of money. Money expects things in return. Let's be blunt about it. And Elon seems to be the one person. I was listening to Arestas Politics just earlier, and they were saying, as the one person, not J.D. Vance, but Musk, that Trump is allowing to get a bit more front of stage. And in return for that, he's offered to or suggested to Trump, and Trump's agreed, yeah, why don't you, Elon, totally reform the whole of the public structure, public services in the US? So those are the sorts of shifts, but I wanted to unpack more of the history and the depth and reach of this, because we might look at Elon Musk as just being about X, or Twitter as it was. He's much more than that, of course, and his interests are much broader, and he's a much bigger figure. So with a personal net worth of $250 billion, to get the dollar signs up there, he has more net worth and more influence than countries, most countries, including Australia. And he's only one of many who are like that. So we've already seen Mark Zuckerberg throw his weight around here a few years ago when the government was proposing to regulate media. And he just switched Facebook off for 10 days until they watered those plans down. So these people have now got to a phase where they can directly intervene. Elon Musk is in a position to switch off all of the rural telephone services in this country that rely on Starlink, to the extent that the military will now use Starlink as their core satellite provider, because we've just made a decision not to have our own indigenous satellite capacity. Companies that are contracted to do that will be able to switch off our national security, core platforms. So these are very big, strategic issues as well. They're big economic issues. And you might say, well, it's always been that way, right? Big money has always brought influence, and industrialists and media moguls have always had an oversized play in any country, and that's all true. However, back in the day, so if I wind the clock back 20 years, and I talk about the free trade agreement between Australia and the US, then things were more regulated, they were more through government. So the US trade representative, who was very well informed by US industry, it's a very tightly put together machine, rocked into Australia and said, well, if you want more access in about 20 years' time for your beef and your sugar and so on, we need a lot more access and rights right now for intellectual property. So if you look at what is actually inside that free trade agreement, it's almost entirely about intellectual property. And that's where we got the copyright term extension by another 20 years. And this is all directly relevant to US industrial interests. Patent term extensions, IP term extensions. This was regulated through government. Now these people can very directly and personally shape policy responses internationally and domestically, and they have certain agendas that they want to push, whether they are radical free speech agendas, and sort of X is a proponent of that, or they're things that are more, I want this government contract for space launch, or I want this government contract for something else. Back to Elon Musk, we also saw him switch off or threaten to switch off Starlink access in Ukraine. I mean, the Russians were using it as well, but the Ukrainians were dependent on it. And then the Pentagon had to hurriedly arrange a deal under which he got funded to do some of these things. So just painting a quick picture there that these tech companies that are now a massive part of the world economy also exert a massive influence on policy, and regardless of whom wins today, that will remain the case. But I think there are broader issues we can talk about in the panel. This is a sort of follow the money, it's the economy stupid type session. And there are things that both candidates are doing that will blow out further the deficit and create problems for future generations, potentially increase inflation. And those are big picture issues we can talk about as well in a historical context rather than just looking at Trump and Harris.
So in the interest of following the economy, I'm going to go to Josh now. So we've just heard about big money. Not everyone's been so fortunate when it comes to money and influence. With the development of technology, we've certainly seen groups of people left behind who are now starting to exercise their own sort of power, not necessarily the covert behind-the-scenes influence that was being discussed earlier, but a more raw power in terms of voting. Would you like to sort of enlighten us on some of that sort of economic populism and what that means in terms of not only this election, but maybe moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of one of the defining things of the Trump era has been his appeal to white working class voters. We're maybe seeing tonight that he's expanding that beyond that white working class, and he's gaining more and more kind of support amongst Latino voters in particular. So what's driving this kind of shift to someone like a Donald Trump? There's a couple of big picture academic theories, right? Some talk about the economy and economic grievance driving it. Essentially, people whose lives aren't as good as they were 20 years ago are feeling angry and insecure. They might not necessarily like Donald Trump, they might not like his personality and all of his policies, but they don't like what they have now, and they think a radical alternative is perhaps a better option. The other kind of argument is a cultural one, that actually, along with all of these massive economic shifts, things just ain't the way they used to be. Cultural values have shifted and changed as well. In practice, it's a mixture of these things which really drive Trump's support. And you can see this kind of, he has that still focus on, we're just going to whack tariffs on China, they took all our jobs, the Mexicans took all our jobs, these kind of things. But he also makes these deep kind of culturally conservative appeals as well, whether that be to evangelicals, which he's managed to do quite successfully. And tonight was put up as kind of a real test of, are people who are feeling kind of put out by Joe Biden's supposedly, high inflation economy, they don't feel like they're doing very well, is that going to win out over abortion rights? As we see right now, that economic argument seems to be winning tonight.
And I think I'd just make the point that it seems to be winning despite some ballot measures that seem to be going quite well for pro-choice advocates. So perhaps not as much of an either-or as maybe originally thought of. In terms of what this means going forward, we're seeing, an environment that's heavily based on people who can scream the loudest, it almost seems, and whether that's with money or with, voting power. But in terms of what that means moving forward from a money perspective, what are some of the potential consequences? What do we have to fear potentially should that sort of tech side of things become a big issue, I guess, or a bigger issue than it currently is?
Yeah, well, I think the trends there are clear. So that part of the economy continues to increase in size and significance. And if you want to get conspiratorial about these things, you can look back behind Elon Musk and you can see people like Peter Thiel, who've had a very big influence on campaign funding, but also J.D. Vance used to work for him in his VC or private equity fund. He funded Trump's campaign before. He was a co-founder, co-partner, funder in Elon Musk's ventures way back into PayPal days. There's a big coalition of interest that's not purely about tech, but also has a sort of political view to it, which now exerts a lot of influence, seemingly, on at least parts of this agenda. So I think there's sort of two components I'd like to highlight there. One is, okay, this is just a bigger part of the economy, therefore you'd expect it to have a bigger influence. And then there's another side to it, which is that these people have very particular views and they are pushing those political views. It's not simply a give me what I want in order to maximise my economic leverage in this situation. So then I think it is worthwhile paying some close attention to the views expressed and on record from some of those people. And different people in the audience, or in America more relevantly, will have different views about that. But to your earlier point about the sort of white, disaffected male voters, that's the hillbilly elegy J.D. Vance line, right? He was playing to that even before he was picked, and that was probably part of why he was picked. But it's only one part of why he was picked. He was picked by these groups of people who are seeking to not only bend the economy, but bend the culture in a particular direction. And that's probably what I think's a little bit more concerning. I think both things are concerning. And then for us here in Australia, America, why is it relevant? Well, it's a dominant force in the world, but also culturally, since I'd say the early 90s. So I went to the UK in 91, 92 to do some postgrad study. Before I left, our culture was very much UK-centric on the media. When I got back, it started to become highly American-centric. And when I was in the UK, I saw it there too. So these cultural memes and people's ideas about law and politics are now shaped not so much by what Australia is, but they're shaped by what America is, because that's a big part of media feed. So my daughters They're always talking about American politics. They're talking about American identity issues and black issues. They're not talking about the problems we have here in this country, which for black people are way worse, right? The position of Indigenous people in this country is way worse than it is, relatively speaking, for black people in America. And yet, because that's in the media feed, that's what gets the attention. Not to say that either is a good thing, but this is why these issues are particularly relevant for us, because they shape our culture, our laws, our economy as well.
And the point's made about money and influence, and I'd like to go to Roger on this one. Obviously, you talked about the amount of money required to be involved in the campaign. Obviously, that's not just the candidate's money. That's money from services in kind from PACs and super PACs, and so what sort of impact do those PACs and super PACs have, and are they something that can shape the narrative and shape the messaging and maybe push candidates in a certain way, vote this way, or you might not get any support from us come the next election?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that when you're looking at the buzzword here is disaffected. We have disaffected voters. We have disaffected people. We have policies that are disaffected. You ever thought about that for a second? Policies that you rely on, and all of a sudden you can't. You have anxiety that comes out of that. Anxiety drives demand for something. Demand is filled in with the only currency that we can use, which is money. We can use activism. We can get behind our candidate. But at the end of the day, if you're spinning, rotating commercials 5-1 over your opponent, okay, you're going to win. You're going to win because you're going to get the 3 to 5 touches that you have on a voter. That's what you have to do. 3 to 5 touches wins the game, gets the message across. So I think at the end of the day, the disaffected voter activist policy is what is on tap today. That's why money plays a major role. In that vacuum, there are many opinions that are happening. There are many opinions being suggested at your homes by your parents, by your brothers, by your employers, speaking of Musk and so on. The fact is that everybody's opinion matters, and it only matters more with more money. So, but look, I gotta give a shout out to the fact that people on the left are just as organized in this as people on the right. This is not an ideological thing. This is an opportunity for anybody who wants to organize for their message. That is the world we live in now, right or wrong. Whether you agree with it or not, Citizens United and Supreme Court have dictated you have a voice with money. Okay? We do have regulations. People do have to abide by them. The more money, when we get to that 15 billion, we get away from the 5 billion, and we get to the 15 billion, that is not money that can coordinate with the presidential candidates. They have their own message. They come out of their own commercials and they advocate. And there are certain words that they can use and they can't use. So things are regulated to a degree. Are they regulated to a comfortable degree here in Adelaide or here in Australia? Maybe not, culturally speaking. But where I'm from Boston. I got to tell you, it's a street fight every 2 years. And every 4 years for president, it's a street fight. Let me tell you something. You don't know who President Obama is because he played nice getting up against Hillary Clinton. He had to raise money. He had to outmaneuver her, out-organize, and that all takes money. And that was money that wasn't going to Hillary. So he brought a whole new group of people to the Democratic Party because of this process. So you can always say there's an up and there's a down, there's a good and there's a bad, but the dynamics of politics in America drive innovation in how we're politicking. Either way, the innovation is there, and we're always seeing every generation has a new lesson. What's funny is we're talking about Trump like it's new. We had Ronald Reagan. It's the same campaign. And literally, Make America Great came from a Reagan speech. Okay, so we're not doing anything tonight that hasn't been done. Okay, what we are looking at is, was COVID an anomaly? Was it because of its behavior? The voters had to behave in a different way. We had, I don't know if you guys know, but we had drive-in town halls. We had cars that came in, and they had town halls based in your car. I got to tell you, I don't think you'll ever see that again, But I throw a little fodder up. But I'm just saying, the fact is, money is driving a lot of things, good and bad. But innovation, finding a way to win inside that, it's not just that he has Elon. People in the Democratic Party have their own actors as well, and they all want power. It's not about necessarily always about ideas. It's about how many seats do we have in the House? How many seats do we have in the Senate? Do we own the Supreme Court? And is the person in the White House going to get in the way? I mean, that's how a party thinks. And Trump has his agenda already rubber stamped in the House. They're working on the Senate, but I do think in the next 4 years, regardless of who wins, the wisest body will, and I know I'll eat these words, but the wisest body will be the Senate. If Trump wins, he comes into it lame duck. And if you don't know what that means, it means he is in his second term in which he can't run again. So all the politicians of D.C. that are looking for a better tomorrow in their career may or may not consider a Trump request to be a valid concern. But he does swing a big stick in the party. But at the same time, he's still, something to think about is his lame duck status the minute he takes oath of office.
Josh, did you just want to quickly jump in
Yes.
before we go, and then we'll go to floor questions. So if you've got any questions lined up, Zoe will come around with a mic in just a moment.
Just something to note about Citizens United, which was that landmark Supreme Court case which let money just pour into the political process. It used to be a very partisan thing. The Democratic Party, when Citizens United was put in place by the Supreme Court, was incredibly against it. And we've seen nowadays that the Democratic Party can at least match, if not beat, the Republican Party in terms of the money it can raise because of these provisions. The Democrats are a lot quieter about money in politics now because they have most of it, right? So there's kind of this thing that money in American politics, absolutely, it's a barrier to entry for people, but it's also at the point of mutually assured destruction. Both sides have more than enough money to compete where they have to compete at the levels they need to compete. So it's not like there's an asymmetry, whereas traditionally, in Australia's, by comparison, rinky-dink campaigns, the Liberal Party has a stronger relationship with capital than the Labor Party. In America, that's very much not the case, and there's very much a kind of cultural value dimension to where that big money comes from.
Just while you're rotating the mic, I think the point Roger made about the Supreme Court's really important. I mean, that's now stacked out for generations to come, yeah. And also, bizarrely enough for us, we don't elect judges here. I'm not saying the Supreme Court's elected process, but over there, in a number of jurisdictions, they elect judges, they elect tax collectors, they elect all sorts of people. So it's very much, what Roger was saying, it's different to what we have here. But I suppose the point I was making before is that young people now think that we run our country like that we have things like rights of freedom of speech, which we don't, and that we organise things in a presidential way. And that even though that's not true, it actually starts to bend how actors work in this country, political actors and other actors.
I think they just about elect the county dog catcher in the US.
Yes.
All right, questions from the floor. Yes.
Hi. This is not so much a question, it's an additional comment to the point Rob and you were making. Elon Musk has now relocated the headquarters of X to Texas, to Austin, Texas, where judges are, local judges, not federal court judges, are elected. And he's spending millions of dollars in local judicial elections to change the composition of the state judiciary there. For both the two kinds of reasons that Rob identified, both to make his business life easier and also to push his social and political, his larger agendas. And I'll still just give a shout out. At 4 o'clock, the panel this afternoon, one of the things I'll be talking about there is about the impact of all of this on the judiciary in the US.
Rob, did you want to make a comment on judge shopping or anything
Totally
like that?
defer to Kathy in that regard. As you can tell from her accent, but also from age and experience, she's totally the person to speak to. So a big endorsement for her session at 4. And there's lots of other good things happening today. If you're not across Rest is Politics, the Goalhanger podcast, they're doing a fantastic live series at the moment. And there's lots of deep insights there that also are historical. So if you listen to people like Dominic Sandbrook, who has history way back when, into the 60s and did his PhD in that stuff, then yeah, totally, there's lots of good intel out there.
Any questions from the floor? Yeah, down at the front.
What do you think are the most significant causes in the sort of ballooning of election campaign cost and lengths as well? Because the campaign, they were starting to announce who was running last year, which is ridiculously early in the campaign to be talking about it.
Some of that. So it's always ongoing. It's always ongoing. So I'm from a state, I say I'm from Boston, but I'm from New Hampshire. New Hampshire enjoys a very particular role. It is the first in the nation state in what you would call pre-selection. So when we get our nominating underway, we vote first in a public election. So we start to see the minute that this president is declared, the other party is going to start sending people next month up to New Hampshire for dinners in their party. So it doesn't start a year ago. It just is always ongoing. But it is a very coveted position. It takes a long time to get known by the voters. In the primaries, we have the parties are splitting themselves 15 different ways on ideology, 15 different ways on resources. And so it's a plurality. You can take the primaries only getting 35% of the party the entire time. So you can just run with it. So I think that, just to note that in America, it's always ongoing. The other party is always looking to replace the current incumbent, and they start immediately. So.
Cool. Marianne?
Thanks very much to the panel. I really appreciate the insights. I wonder if you might comment, please, on whether you see any threats to the US dollar and also the extent of the US deficit and the projections that this will be extended under either candidate, but particularly exaggerated under the Trump administration. Thank you.
Any volunteers? Don't all rush at once.
Well, I'm not an economist, Marianne, but we all know about the tariffs that would cause problem to the dollar. But I'm not an economist. I have read that would be a problem. I can also tell you that policy is not written until the guy takes the oath. And I think I think we'll wait for January 7th to see what he's carving up. Because the reality could be different from the promises. Although I wouldn't say that Trump would walk back on a promise, he's a salesman. He'll find a way to make it a win, whatever it is.
Yeah, he's very transactional, yeah. So he's going to, people are speculating about whether he will reshape the deal for AUKUS and demand a higher price for that. And even Carolyn Kennedy, I think, has said, look, we've got issues, and so, sort of setting the ground in a neutral way for what either administration might do in that regard. But, these things have consequences for Australia, because if really under either side, and it's historical, this goes back to pre-World War II. It's quite an isolationist phase, yeah, for America, protectionist, isolationist. You drive up barriers, trade barriers, well, that has impacts around the world. You localise production, you increase inflation, it impacts relative dollar prices around the global money markets, but it also crimps demand for our products. If we have a major trading partner that's China, and China is being subject to all of these imposts more than anyone else, it has this indirect ripple effect on us. We've got some degree of protection from the FTA, but not completely, because of these other trade exposures we have, because we're highly trade exposed. So our interests have conventionally been multipolar, open borders, open trade, but hey, for quite some time now, for at least 10 years, probably longer, we've been moving away from, maybe 20 years, away from globalisation, away from GATT, away from WTO. The US has sabotaged under all administrations WTO panel arrangements. And now it's very much transactional, it's bilateral, it's some regional stuff, and everyone's playing the game. It's not like America is the only person playing the game. All the big powers are playing these games. But there's certainly one of them, and what they do will have big impacts on us. And as I think I heard you as I was walking past, it's the security implications of this. There's lots of people talking about that. Lots of people have written on it, more informed than I. But Australia's now in a position where it's tough for us in the next little while, because we're a small player at the arse end of the world, and we have our interests being pulled in many different directions. Our security interests being pulled one way, economic another. It's not all aligned. It's not all nice and cosy. It's quite hard.
And I think as well, just to reiterate the discussions we had on the last panel, a Donald Trump presidency most likely means a less American-centric world, right? Let's be kind of clear about that. He will create a larger gap between America and Europe. America and Europe under the last Trump presidency began to have real kind of fractious issues over the future of NATO. There's no reason to think that won't continue, but there certainly will be a greater degree of instability. Trump's gut reaction is to oppose kind of existing liberal world institutions, including those ones of economic globalization. And there's no reason to think he won't be like this in a second term. We just don't know exactly how, because he probably hasn't really thought that far ahead yet.
Thank you. In the panel, there was a mention of Trump being like a lame duck president in 2016, when he failed to pass a lot of his bills. But I think a lot of the fear and anxiety a lot of people have going into this election with Trump is that he seems to be a lot more effective in getting sort of his way through the House of Reps and through the Senate, when, for example, Mitch McConnell followed his word like it was gospel and shot down the border bill that the Republicans were fighting for previously. And with even Mitch McConnell stepping down because the Trump might not view him as extreme enough or loyal enough. How would, I guess, that kind of going into a sort of strengthened Trump GOP in terms of its loyalty to him and his policies occur?
I think something to think about here. Not only, is this going to be a Trump who's kind of less held together by existing guardrails, he's going to be more kind of hell-bent on tearing them down, right? He's said as much in his statements. One thing he is consistent about is the politics of grievance, right? And those personal grievances. Something that maybe we should think about going forward, as it's increasingly looking like this afternoon is turning towards. What does a post-Trump GOP look like? Is it still a Trump GOP with him as this spectre hanging over the background? Is it a party that moves back towards the centre under, say, a Nikki Haley? I tend to think tonight's probably vindication for a Trumpist continuation throughout the GOP and the fight for the next nominations between RFK Jr. and JD Vance, maybe throw in some Ron DeSantis as well. I think we start to see a kind of vindication of that right-wing populist approach, and I think that's going to be the continuation as we go forward. And what that means for the economies overall, right-wing populists, they don't like some aspects of liberal globalisation, but they are pretty in favour of corporate tax cuts and things like this. So it's going to be a very kind of mixed economic agenda, right?
I think Vivek in there would be another one that you would throw in the list as well.
Of course.
Any other questions from the floor?
So earlier, Josh talked about the economic versus the social issues that cause the rise of populism. How do you think, specifically in 2024, Trump has used these two to create a campaign? I know this isn't like directly like economic, but it just sort of like puts everything into perspective.
I'll be really brief, and then maybe Roger has some reflections. I would argue that Trump actually didn't do a fantastic job of putting together a campaign this time. If he wins, it's due to underlying conditions that have led towards it. In 2016, he had this really clear, we'll bring the jobs back message. You didn't really see that from Trump on the campaign trail. This time, you saw him talking about Hannibal Lecter for, hours at a time. So I think it's more really people have just kind of internalized and associated his 2016 messaging with Donald Trump, and they know he stands for that. He owns those issues, and that's probably what's been driving his support. Again, I don't want to be an economist, but the fact is we have a different world on the other side of the pandemic. We have a supply side problem, okay? We have people that have been campaigning for protectionism since the mid-90s.
This is not a new thing. It was just brought back because we had years of fast-track trade, okay? Years of exporting jobs. And then when we have a supply-side problem, we've sent the jobs abroad, and now we don't have things on shore to take care of us, then people are starting to talk about it. I think he ends up adopting what was already a protectionist policy, but it's a good environment to start talking about it. People are feeling a bit of the flu from the recession in China. You know, is it coming our way? Are we going to wind up, you know, underneath? Even though we're doing okay, he's selling that we won't. Okay, so I think the conditions are already, to kind of say, the conditions are already there, but they have been there for 30 years. They've been there. Economic nationalism was a thing under Patrick Buchanan, which is one of the guys he listens to in Washington. So we're talking 30, 35 years ago. Okay, and that was a reaction to Rockefeller Republicans and Bush Republicans. So this war that you see inside the party, the Republican Party, has been going on for 3 decades.
Yeah, didn't Donald Trump disavow Pat Buchanan in his 2000 book?
I mean, maybe, you know.
Trump did a lot of things since 2000, so...
Yeah, he was also a Democrat. He was also a Clinton supporter. He was...
Yes, at the back.
Hey, my question's about, will we see a move away from going on the path towards protectionism if Trump wins? So say if Trump wins and we have protectionism in the US, and that causes trade wars between the US and nations trading with the US, will the rest of the world kind of see the economic impacts of what's happening in the US and also see to fill in those gaps of where the US has left their economic sphere and want to replace it with other countries and not replicate the same economic circumstances we might see in the US now if tariffs are implemented there? Or will we kind of just continue down the same path the US is on, heading towards protectionism?
Look, again, I think all of the story and all down the panel you hear the same thing. This is a continuation of thematics that have been running for quite some time. And so what I would point to is some of the stuff I mentioned before, the bilateral and regional trade pact arrangements that have been really ramping up over the last decade. And they're being driven by different players. So you've got RCEP, which is largely a sort of China push, but you've got Trans-Pacific, so you had the US trying to work something up. That fell over because they went out of being too multilateral or too regional. China moved into that gap. But everyone is going to be positioning in their own ways. And as these barriers come up, an economic barrier creates a security friction point as well. It's not separate from security, right? So onshoring has a security dimension to it. You've got supply chain issues, which are security supply chain issues. They're not just-in-time problems. And so this is dangerous. It's dangerous for world geopolitics, but it's not like anyone can flick a switch and it's all cool again. So you can feel the temperature ramping up. You can feel various people, like Europe's in a bit of a Barney at the moment with the Chinese about EVs, for example. So everyone's playing more to their own interests, more to their own backyard, and the more each of us do that, it just ratchets up.
On that note, we might wind this panel up here. Thank you all for attending. Thank you to our panelists. You can all give them a round of applause. Our next panel will be at 3 o'clock on women's rights, gender and sexuality with Dr. Prudence Flowers and Dr. Leonie Connor. Thank you.